Hi, everybody. We're going to start our lecture now on the digestive system. This is out of chapter 16. I'm going to truncate this lecture into several different parts because there are several different parts of the digestive system. So I'm going to try to keep note of the time. Uh, and so, yeah, I think we might do different videos in different parts here. Alrighty, so let's get started though. Let's look at the overview of the digestive system. So our digestive system, it's a pretty long system, and basically in vertebrates, the digestive system really lengthened, and what it does is it allows us to be more efficient digesters. It gives us longer time to be able to digest the food that we've eaten and to create different environments so that we can digest the important or have important enzymes to help us break down food stuff. And then we also get to eat bigger pieces of food. So when we started out as single-celled organisms, those single-celled organisms would take molecules from the environment in order to do the processes that they do. Well, we know that organisms are made out of these molecules. So now we can take bigger pieces of food from those organisms, bigger chunks, and then through the process of digestion, we break down those big molecules into small, or those big pieces of food into their component molecular parts in order to digest, or in order to absorb that across the cell membrane, right, and get it into our bloodstream, who will then distribute it to all of our body. Right? So basically, the primary function of the digestive system is not only to transfer nutrients, water, and electrolytes, but we obtain that from our environment, again, in larger pieces, and then we need to be able to break those macromolecules down into the small single molecules that again can move across cell membranes into our digestive system. So I'm going to come back to this slide in just a second, but I just want to show you, and this is probably a reminder to those of you who have had anatomy, that our digestive tract is basically one big long tube, and then that tube kind of gets folded up here and there. But it has these four major tissue layers. The very inner layer is called the mucosa. And remember, that's the epithelial layer. So when we get to areas of the body, which is mainly just the small intestines, that inner mucosal layer is usually simple columnar epithelial tissue. And that's the one simple, so it's one cell layer thick. So again, we have to have molecules small enough so that, or food nutrients small enough into their molecular form so that they can cross that layer and get inside. The capillaries are infused throughout the submucosal layer. All right, so the capillaries are right on the other end to be able to absorb those nutrients. Okay, so we have to be able to do that. We'll also see that another function of the digestive system, the way that it is structured, is to help us move these food stuff throughout this entire digestive system. Again, it's very long. It's like 30 feet long. So in order to be able to move it through, that's this idea of motility, right? So there's two types of motility. There's propulsive movements, which helps us to, these organs will push contents forward through the digestive tract, right? And so we can do that because outside of the submucosal layer, we also have the smooth muscle layer. Okay, so recall from anatomy, you've got usually two layers of smooth muscle. The stomach has three layers of smooth muscle. And so that's where we need to actually move this food through the different segments of our digestive tract. Okay, and then the very outer layer is the serosa, and the serosa helps to connect our organs to the body wall, wherever it is. Okay. Remember though, in the esophagus, we had that thicker connective tissue layer. Instead of serosa, it was called the adventitia. So that's all I'm going to say about tissues, because tissues were studied in depth in anatomy. So if you don't remember these things or you haven't had anatomy, then you should look these over in the textbook and make sure you really understand these layers, because I'm just going to kind of go over the function of those layers, okay, as we go into the different systems of our digestive tract. Okay, so that I just mentioned one type of motility, that's propulsive, but there's also mixing. So what we need to do is we need to mix the contents inside of our digestive system. And so all along the way, we're going to be secreting what we call juices. We're going to secrete fluids, that's mainly water, but also it's going to contain sometimes enzymes, it's going to contain electrolytes, it's going to might contain acids, all these things that are needed to help facilitate digestion and the movement. And so we need to be able to mix the contents of that, so that smooth muscle layer will contract in a different way in order to mix these digestive juices to help promote the digestion of the food. Okay, and then that also facilitates the absorption of the nutrients by exposing all parts of the intestinal contents to absorbing surfaces of the digestive tract. So let me skip to this one again. So remember, within our digestive system, if this is in the absorbing segment of our small intestines, like the jejunum, then that epithelial layer, that's the luminal surface. Remember, the lumen is the space inside. So the lumen is where these juices are flowing through. So when we get to the area where we're going to absorb those nutrients, the nutrients are dissolved in the fluids. And so this muscle layer needs to mix the contents so it helps those nutrients and the fluid just come in contact with the surface. I forgot to use my laser pointer. There we go. With the surface of the luminal surface of the inside of those absorptive surfaces, and then that way we can get when they touch those surfaces, we get the movement of nutrients across. And that movement could be by simple diffusion, it could be by facilitated diffusion, it might be active transport, it just really depends on the nutrient that's being moved across. Okay, so that's the mixing. I mentioned secretion already. So again, throughout our digestive system, certain organs will be secreting fluids to facilitate digestion. So again, that could be water, electrolytes, it might be different organic constituents, but it just gets released into the digestive tract lumen, and it gets stimulated. So how does the organ system know when to release this fluid? It's basically stimulated by nerves or by hormones, and we'll discuss that a little bit later in this lecture, right? And then, so all of that, again, facilitates the actual digestion. So again, the actual digestion is the biochemical breakdown of structurally complex foodstuffs. And we break it down into smaller units that are absorbable. So it has to be small enough to be able to absorb across that epithelial layer and get to the capillaries. So that's the absorption part. So after digestion, when things are small enough, we can absorb it. So remember, in your food, you eat you eat carbohydrates, right? And so I say remember because this is a concept from general biology, right? So you eat carbohydrates, and remember that carbohydrates can be really complex. There are several sugar molecules, usually glucose, it could be fructose, it could be other things like that, and they're connected to one another. So a polysaccharide is a big molecule with a lot of these what are called monomers, these smaller single unit molecules attached to one another. So our enzymes can take that monomer or polysaccharide and break it down into disaccharides, which will be two connected to one another. And then we want to get it down to the monosaccharide, which is usually like glucose or fructose or something like that. Remember, proteins are big molecules that have a complex structure to them. So we need to break those down to their individual amino acid parts, right? And so it's the individual amino acids that get absorbed across. Fats get broken down into a glycerol and the fatty acids. Those are their component parts. There's also nucleic acids, so we break those down into nucleotides. Okay, so that's kind of a review from general biology. So you want to make sure you review that and make sure you remember what those things are. Okay. All right, so let's start. We're going to start in the oral cavity, right? And so again, you went through many of these structures in anatomy. All right, so we have the lips, they form the opening. The lips help to procure the food. You don't even realize how much you use your lips to grab onto something, guide the food, and help contain it in the mouth. So your lips, you can purse them together to keep food from falling out. All right, it even helps with that tactile sensation. And so sometimes we investigate our food with our lips first. Right? And then you've got the palate forms the roof of the oral cavity so that it separates it from the nasal cavity, right? You've got the uvula, so that's the end of the soft palate. So the uvula here is that little fleshy structure that hangs down that during swallowing, it helps us to determine if we've processed the food so it's soft enough to swallow. And if it's not, you get that gag reflex. You want to push it back up to your mouth. But if it is ready to swallow, the uvula will seal off the opening into the nasopharynx, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Of course, you have your tongue that forms the floor of the oral cavity, and that's skeletal muscle. So the movements are really important to aid in chewing and swallowing. Okay, and of course, remember the taste buds are on there as well. Then outside of the oral cavity, we get to the pharynx. So this is the cavity at the rear of the throat. It's a common passageway for digestion as well as respiratory systems as well. And so that's where we have a series of tonsils within the sidewalls. I just turned on Siri because I said series. Sorry. Not yet, Siri. Anyway, so you have the tonsils in the sidewalls of the pharynx, and that's lymphoid tissue. So we have some immunity cells concentrated there because we're bringing something from the external environment into our body. So that helps us with that. And then, of course, we have the teeth that helps with mastication. So all of this is kind of helping to process the food, the teeth, the lips, the tongue, right? And that is the first step in digestion. We're going to mechanically break the food down. So that's a mechanical digestion. Okay. We have a couple more structures though that are very important that we can see on this slide. Remember your salivary glands. So again, in anatomy, you learned about the pair of parotid salivary glands, the pair of submandibular salivary glands right on the underside of your mandible, and then the pair of sublingual salivary glands, a pair right under your tongue. And just recently I had heard that scientists discovered another pair of salivary glands deep in your throat. So we don't have to worry about those right now. I'll have to find out more about that. But hey, once in a while, anatomists discover something new. It's kind of cool, right? So anyway, these salivary glands are important because they produce the saliva. So here's one of the digestive juices I was talking about. They mainly secrete water, but it also is going to be composed of electrolytes and protein. And the protein is in the form of an enzyme. So one of the main one is amylase. There's also mucus in there that's going to help lubricate the food. And then there's a lysozyme that helps to destroy bacteria right away, right? So again, we're bringing something in from the external environment that could have something dangerous for us. So we put a lysozyme in there that just helps to kill the bacteria, right? And then the saliva also helps to rinse away material that could be used as a food source for bacteria as well. Okay, so all of that contributes to the saliva inside. So again, we have a digestive enzyme. The first one there, this is salivary amylase. It begins the digestion of carbohydrates, right? And so we're actually chemically digesting within there. Okay, so the chewing of the food helps to break apart the bigger pieces. Because remember that the enzyme, a piece needs to fit in the enzyme for the enzyme to be able to chemically break it down. So remember, chemical digestion helps to break bonds, and it brings it back down into either the disaccharide or monosaccharide form. Okay, again, mucus is lubricating. Also, the water is a solvent for that chemical reaction to occur with the enzyme, of course. Now, there is an enzyme to break down lipids at this point. It's a lipase, but it's pretty, we don't have much of it in the mouth, and I don't think it really significantly contributes to the breakdown of lipids in the mouth. We'll see that that happens later. So I'm just going to hold you to remembering salivary amylase. Okay, make sure you remember that one. Okay, so let's look at the control of saliva, of how we control secreting it, right? And so this is kind of going to bring us back to what we learned in the nerve system. We can have a simple reflex occurring here. So there's actually, in your mouth, you've got mechanoreceptors, or these pressure receptors. Okay, so that tells you, oh, I've got food in my mouth. You've also got chemoreceptors, remember, in the form of taste buds and things. And so that's going to send a signal to the center in your medulla oblongata, right? And we actually have a salivary center there. And that will immediately stimulate autonomic nerves to stimulate your salivary glands, and you increase saliva, right? There's also input coming from the cerebral cortex. So you might be thinking of food. You might hear somebody talking about food, right? This is more of a conditioned reflex, right? So it's a little bit longer, and it's usually based on learning. So if somebody is telling you about maybe a food from their home country that you've never heard of before, you're probably not going to elicit a salivary response because you don't know if it's good or not. Okay, but if they invite you to your home, let's hope they do, and you get to taste the food and you love it, right? You just love it. Then the next time somebody just talks about it, the cerebral cortex, then you'll start to think about it, right? That's coming from the cerebral cortex, and start this conditioned reflex. Okay. Yeah, so there you go. So mostly though, once you get the food in your mouth, that's just a simple reflex, right? We go medulla, sensory nerve to medulla, to motor nerve, to stimulating your salivary glands, right? So there's your receptor, sensory nerve, integrator, efferent nerve, effector, your 5 steps in a simple reflex. All right. That brings us to the esophagus, okay? We've been chewing food, right? Now we need to swallow it, okay? And so swallowing has several steps to it. So I should actually put here the pharynx and the esophagus. Actually, let me go back a couple steps. So remember that we have the pharynx. I did mention it, that it is shares it's a tube we share with the respiratory system. The nasopharynx is just outside, or just inside, I should say, of the nasal cavity. So we don't usually share this portion with the digestive system. The uvula blocks that off. And you've experienced that, the uncomfortableness of food getting up there if you're laughing, and when you have food in your mouth and you snort it, and it means you upset the sequence of events that we're going to talk about, and food goes up through the nasal pharynx into your nasal cavity. That's never any fun. right? But there's also the oropharynx, and then the laryngopharynx is down here, and the laryngopharynx is where it separates and moves toward the respiratory system. I should be pointing more forward, down the trachea, and the food goes down the back toward the esophagus. Okay, so that's what we've got here. So here you can see the green is the food. So after we masticate it, meaning chewing it, and we mix it with all of the saliva, and we start the chemical digestion, it forms a soft piece of food called a bolus. And so the bolus is what we swallow down. And again, so here you can see our esophagus is a muscular tube, and it lies right behind the trachea. Here's the trachea in front of it. Remember, our trachea has rings of cartilage around it that holds it open. Okay, the esophagus is a muscular tube, and it's actually collapsed against the back of the trachea until we swallow. And then it kind of, the movement of the muscle and the food helps to push it open. Okay, and then we have sphincters at each end. There's a pharyngoesophageal sphincter. So pharyngo means it's an esophageal, means it's a sphincter in between those two portions. Okay, and a sphincter is a band of muscle that we can control the opening and closing, and we usually do that to control things passing through, right? And then down near your stomach, and you can't see it in this picture, but we have the gastroesophageal sphincter. So gastro refers to the stomach. So that's at the end of the esophagus where the stomach begins, there's a sphincter. So we can control the movement of the bolus going into our stomach. Okay, and then the esophagus has the ability to produce secretions. It's mainly just mucus, and its only function is to protect the passageway going down. We don't secrete any enzymes or things. But the bolus is mixed with enzymatic juices and things. So digestion, chemical digestion is still occurring within the bolus as we swallow it down. So let's look at the sequence of events on the slide. Okay, so again, this is initiated by the swallowing center up in our brainstem. Okay, the swallowing center inhibits the respiratory center. Okay, this is why when you're swallowing, you're not really breathing at the same time. You can't, because we're going to block off, when you swallow, you're going to see we're going to block off the trachea, so we can't really breathe. So we actually do inhibit the respiratory center, so you don't try to breathe when that happens. And so initiation of raising the tongue. Okay, this is the oropharyngeal stage. You raise your tongue, that puts the pressure of the bolus against the soft palate, and it causes it to slide down toward the oral pharynx, and the uvula raises up, preventing the food from entering those nasal passages, right? And your tongue also raises up, and it kind of prevents the food from squishing back into your mouth. Right, and then again, as the bolus comes down, it puts pressure on the epiglottis so that it folds downward and covers the trachea. Okay, and covers the opening of the trachea, is called the glottis. Right, and so now the food bolus is conducted downward. So this starts what we call the a voluntary response. At first is the initial swallowing. But once the food then starts to get down the oropharynx and down, it's not voluntary anymore. Then it becomes involuntary muscular contractions pulling it down, right? And so the way it contracts is, again, the two layers of the muscle, smooth muscle in our esophagus. And remember from anatomy, actually the upper layers are skeletal. That's why we start with the upper layers. It's initiated a voluntary response, but then it becomes smooth muscle and it's all involuntary, right? And so the circular muscle can pinch off above the bolus, right? And that prevents the bolus from going upward. And then the longitudinal muscle can shorten, and that pulls the bolus downward. And then the next contraction will pinch off at the new position of the bolus to prevent it from going any further up that direction. and our longitudinal muscles. So this is called peristaltic waves of contraction, right? It just kind of contracts in sequence, moving the food stuff all the way down. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video here because this took about 26 minutes just to talk about food in the mouth and swallowing it down. So the next step is we're going to look at what happens when food enters the stomach. Right, so I will be back to share that with you.